The day Lisa asked for a divorce was seared into my memory like a scar that refused to fade. We were sitting in the living room, our living room, the one I had worked tirelessly to maintain over the years. The cushion still had the faint smell of her lavender perfume, and the kids' art projects hung proudly on the fridge. It was our home, the life we built together. Or so I thought. "I need to talk to you," Lisa said, her voice unnervingly calm. I looked up from the bills I was sorting, noting the strange glint in her eye. "What's up?" I asked, trying to mask the unease creeping up my spine. "I want a divorce." I blinked, certain I'd misheard her. "What are you talking about, Lisa?" Her words hit me like a freight train. "I've met someone, Mark. His name is Jake, and I love him. I've been unhappy for years, and I can't do this anymore." It was like the air had been sucked out of the room. The walls seemed to close in, and the weight of her words pressed down on my chest. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was saying. We had problems, sure, but what couple didn't? Unhappy? Since when? Jake? I repeated, the name unfamiliar and bitter on my tongue. "He's younger. He understands me, and he makes me feel alive again," Lisa continued, her tone laced with a smugness that made my stomach churn. "Alive?" I snapped, unable to keep my frustration in check. "Lisa, we've built a life together. A family. What about the kids?" "They'll adjust," she said coldly, brushing off the question like it was a minor inconvenience. "And Jake will move in as soon as the divorce is finalized. It's time for me to be happy, Mark." Her indifference was like a knife to the gut. I searched her face for any hint of regret, any sign that she might reconsider, but all I saw was a woman who had already made up her mind. "I've always supported you," I said, my voice quieter now, tinged with disbelief. "When you wanted to go back to school, I made it happen. When you needed help with your parents, I was there. And this is how you repay me?" Lisa shrugged, as if my sacrifices meant nothing. "It's not about you, Mark. It's about me." The conversation ended with her standing up and walking away, leaving me sitting there, stunned and alone. I wanted to shout, to cry, to throw something, but I did none of those things. Instead, I sat there, staring at the bills on the table, the world I thought I knew crumbling around me. That night, as Lisa slept in the guest room she had suddenly claimed as her own, I lay awake, replaying the conversation in my head. I couldn't let her smugness, her betrayal, break me. I didn't have a plan yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't let her and this Jake guy bulldoze through my life without a fight. For now, I'd bide my time. Let Lisa think she'd won. But deep down, the fire in me was already ignited. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The divorce papers were barely dry when Jake made his grand entrance into what used to be my home. He didn't bother knocking. No, he walked in like he owned the place, dragging 2 oversized duffel bags behind him and wearing a cocky grin that made me clench my fists. "Make room for Jake," Lisa said with a smirk, standing behind him. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, as if waiting for me to protest. I didn't. Not yet. I glanced at the kids, Emily and Lucas, who were sitting on the couch. Emily was fiddling nervously with her bracelet, and Lucas stared at the floor, his little shoulders hunched. They knew something wasn't right. How could they not? A stranger had just waltzed into their home like he belonged there, and their mother was acting like it was the most normal thing in the world. Jake's first act of dominance was to plop himself down on the armchair I'd bought years ago, the one I sat in every evening after work. He spread out like a king surveying his kingdom, patting the armrests as if to mark his territory. I wanted to rip him out of that chair, but I forced myself to stay calm. Not here. Not in front of the kids. "Nice place," Jake said, looking around. His tone was dripping with condescension. "Could use a little updating, though. Don't worry, Lisa and I have big plans." He winked at her, and she laughed, a sound I hadn't heard directed at me in months. Big plans? My jaw tightened, but I swallowed my anger. "Glad you like it," I said evenly, my voice giving nothing away. Lisa shot me a smug look, like she'd just won some kind of competition. "We're thinking of starting with the kitchen," she said, walking over to stand beside Jake. "It's a little outdated, don't you think?" I didn't respond. Instead, I turned to Emily and Lucas. Why don't you two go play upstairs for a bit? I suggested gently. They hesitated but eventually nodded, leaving the tension-filled room without a word. Jake waited until the kids were out of earshot before turning his attention back to me. You know, he said, leaning forward, this is going to be a big adjustment for everyone, but I think in time, you'll see I'm not such a bad guy. I stared at him, my face an unreadable mask. Is that so? I asked, my tone sharp enough to cut through the air. Absolutely, Jake said, flashing that infuriating grin. I mean, it can't be easy, losing everything like this. But hey, we'll try to make this transition as smooth as possible for you. Losing everything? The sheer arrogance of the man was almost impressive. I looked at Lisa, hoping for some sign that she realized how ridiculous he sounded, but she just stood there, arms folded. Watching like this was her entertainment for the evening. I nodded slowly, forcing a tight-lipped smile. Well, Jake, I appreciate your generosity, I said, my words laced with sarcasm. But let me be clear about something. This house, this life, you don't get to just walk in here and act like you've won. You're a guest. For now. Jake raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. We'll see about that, he said, his voice low and challenging. Lisa interjected, clearly enjoying the tension. Mark, let's not make this harder than it needs to be, she said, her tone dripping with fake concern. Jake's here now, and things are going to change. Maybe it's time for you to move on. Move on. The words hit me like a slap in the face. But instead of reacting, I just smiled. A genuine smile this time. Because in that moment, I realized something important. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd backed me into a corner, that I was powerless to stop them. But they were wrong. So very wrong. Don't worry, I said, standing up. I'll move on when the time is right. But for now, I think I'll stick around. After all, I'm still part of this house. Jake smirked, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Lisa looked confused, as if she couldn't quite figure out why I wasn't reacting the way she expected. I walked past them, heading toward the stairs. Make yourselves comfortable, I said over my shoulder. But don't get too used to it. As I climbed the stairs to check on Emily and Lucas, I allowed myself a small smile. Let them think they'd won. Let them revel in their little victory. Because soon enough, they'd learn the hard way that I wasn't the kind of man who rolled over and let people walk all over him. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The days following Jake's smug arrival were some of the hardest I'd ever endured. Every room I walked into felt tainted by his arrogance, his audacity. He strutted around like a rooster, making little adjustments to the house I had worked so hard to build. My home, the one that held years of memories, now felt like enemy territory. Lisa, for her part, seemed to relish her newfound partnership with Jake. They whispered to each other like high school sweethearts, giggling as if their behavior wasn't destroying the foundation of a life we'd built together. The worst part? They acted as if I didn't exist, treating me like an unwanted guest in my own house. But I kept my cool. Every smile, every nod, every calm reply. It was all part of my plan. One evening, as I watched Jake lounging on the couch with his feet on the coffee table, I knew it was time to start moving the pieces into place. I'm thinking of clearing out some of my stuff, I said casually, breaking the silence. Jake didn't even look up from his phone. About time, he muttered, as if his opinion mattered. Lisa smirked from the dining table, where she was scrolling through a home decor website. Planning to downsize, Mark? That's probably for the best. I bit back a sarcastic response and instead offered a nonchalant shrug. Yeah, clearing out the old to make room for the new. It's just stuff. Lisa gave me a patronizing look. Well, let us know if you need help packing, she said sweetly. Too sweetly. Will do, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. What they didn't know was that every move I made from that point on was deliberate. I began packing up my personal belongings under the guise of simplifying my life. But it wasn't just clutter I was removing. I was strategically taking anything of value, both sentimental and financial. My father's old watch, the artwork we'd bought on our honeymoon, the documents that tied me to this house. It all quietly disappeared into boxes. Meanwhile, I made a few calls. First to my lawyer, to confirm the fine print of our divorce settlement. The clause about me retaining partial control over the house for 6 months? That was going to be my ace in the hole. Then to a contractor, a friend of a friend, to discuss some necessary repairs to the property. I kept Lisa and Jake in the dark about my plans, letting them continue their little fantasy of revamping the house. Jake, with his inflated ego, had grand ideas for renovations. "We're going to knock out that wall," he told Lisa one afternoon, gesturing toward the living room. "Open concept is in. And maybe we'll redo the kitchen too. It's a little dated." I forced myself not to laugh. "Sounds ambitious," I said. "Hope you've got a solid plan for that." "Oh, don't worry," Jake replied with a cocky grin. "I've got it all under control." Control. That word rolled around in my mind long after the conversation ended. Jake thought he was in control. Lisa thought she was in control. But they were both living in a bubble, oblivious to the storm I was quietly brewing. One night, after Lisa and Jake had gone to bed, I stood in the garage, looking over the boxes I'd packed. It wasn't just material things I was taking with me. It was leverage. Every piece of this house that mattered was already mine. All I had to do now was wait for the right moment to strike. Before heading back inside, I opened my phone and sent a message to my contractor. "Let's move forward. Start Monday." The reply came almost instantly. "You got it?" As I climbed the stairs, I felt a strange sense of calm. Jake and Lisa could laugh, mock, and flaunt their so-called victory all they wanted. They thought they had me cornered, but what they didn't realize was that I was already 10 steps ahead. "Good night, Mark," Lisa said sweetly as I passed their bedroom door, her voice dripping with insincerity. "Good night," I replied, smiling to myself, because soon, the game they thought they were winning was about to change, and I held all the cards. Monday morning arrived with a sense of quiet anticipation. I woke up early, earlier than usual, and got ready for what I knew would be an unforgettable day. By the time I stepped outside with my coffee, the contractors were already unloading their tools from the truck. The rhythmic clang of equipment was music to my ears. Jake was the first to notice something was off. He walked out onto the porch, his hair still a mess from sleep, and stared at the workers in confusion. "Hey," he called out, his voice groggy but laced with irritation. "What the hell is going on?" One of the contractors, a burly man named Greg, glanced up from his clipboard. "We're here for the scheduled repairs," he said simply, pointing toward the front door. "Repairs?" Jake asked, his confusion deepening. "What repairs?" By then, Lisa had joined him on the porch, her arms crossed and her face twisted in irritation. "Mark," she snapped, her eyes narrowing as she spotted me leaning against my car. "What is this?" I sipped my coffee leisurely, savoring the moment. "Oh, didn't I mention? We're doing some necessary work on the house. It's all in the settlement paperwork." Lisa looked like she was ready to explode. "What are you talking about? You don't live here anymore. You can't just—" "Actually," I interrupted, pulling out a folded copy of the divorce agreement from my jacket. "I retained partial control of the property for 6 months. Remember? You signed it." I unfolded the paper and handed it to her, watching as her face turned pale while she skimmed the highlighted sections. "You've got to be kidding me," Jake muttered, snatching the paper from her hands. He read it over, his frown deepening with every word. "This is a joke, right?" "No joke," I said, smiling. "It's all perfectly legal. And those necessary repairs?" I nodded toward Greg and his crew, who were already pulling up sections of the driveway. "They're starting today." Lisa's frustration boiled over. "This is petty, Mark. You're being vindictive." "Vindictive?" I raised an eyebrow. "This is maintenance. The house needs work, Lisa. I'm just doing my part to make sure it's livable for all of us." Jake tried to assert himself, stepping closer and puffing out his chest. "You think you can just disrupt our lives like this?" I didn't flinch. "Disrupt your lives? Funny. I thought that's what you two have been doing to mine for months." Lisa's protest continued as Greg and his team got to work. The sound of drills and hammers quickly drowned out her complaints, but her anger was unmistakable. Jake looked like he wanted to argue more, but he was out of his depth and he knew it. The day only got worse for them. By noon, The kitchen was unusable, with cabinets and appliances removed under the guise of renovation. The living room floor was stripped bare, leaving nothing but cold concrete beneath their feet. Jake's smug confidence began to crumble as he realized the extent of the disruption. "I can't believe you're doing this," Lisa said later that evening as I packed up my things to leave. "You can't believe I'm doing this?" I repeated, my tone calm but firm. "After everything you've done, Lisa, this is the least of what you deserve. You wanted the house? Fine. But you're going to have to deal with the reality that I'm not out of the picture yet." She glared at me, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. "You think this is going to make you feel better?" "It's not about feeling better," I said, meeting her gaze. "It's about reminding you, and your boyfriend, that actions have consequences." Jake tried to pipe up, but I held up a hand to stop him. "Save it, Jake. You've been riding high for weeks, thinking you had it all figured out. But here's the thing. You can't win a game when you don't even know the rules." I walked out of the house that night with my head held high, leaving them to deal with the chaos I'd set in motion. Every step I took away from that house felt lighter, freer, like I was finally reclaiming a piece of myself they had tried to take. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and smiled. This was only the beginning. The days that followed were a symphony of chaos, and I was the conductor. Lisa and Jake, now confined to a gutted house with no functioning kitchen, had no choice but to endure the repairs, or so they thought. The best part? They didn't even know the crescendo was yet to come. It was a Tuesday morning when the phone call came. I was at my lawyer's office, finalizing the paperwork to enact the next phase of my plan. The woman on the other end was polite but firm. "We've reviewed the shared financial accounts," she said. "You're well within your rights to freeze your portion." I leaned back in my chair, a small smile creeping across my face. Do it. Lisa and Jake were about to learn just how much power I still held. That evening, I got the first inkling that the storm had arrived. My phone buzzed with a series of texts from Lisa. "Mark, what the hell is going on? The joint account isn't working. The credit cards are declining. Did you do something? Call me back. Now." I ignored the messages, letting her stew in the uncertainty. The truth was, our financial arrangements had always been something of a safety net for Lisa. Even after the divorce, I'd been generous enough to leave her access to a shared account, knowing she'd need it to keep the house running. But now, with Jake in the picture, my generosity had its limits. By the next day, the calls started. Lisa's number flashed on my phone screen repeatedly, but I let them go to voicemail. Each time, her tone grew more frantic. Finally, she left a message that I couldn't help but listen to. "Mark, I need to talk to you. This isn't funny anymore. The contractors are asking for payment, and the utilities are past due. I know you're upset, but can't we be adults about this?" I chuckled. Adults? Coming from the woman who let her boyfriend pour macaroni on my face during a barbecue, the irony was almost too much to bear. A few days later, I got another call, this time from Jake. His voice dripped with thinly veiled frustration. "Mark," he said, trying to sound authoritative, "we need to have a conversation. You're being petty, and it's affecting Lisa's ability to manage the household." I couldn't help but laugh. "Manage the household?" I echoed. "You mean the household I built? The one you waltzed into and claimed as your own?" "Look," Jake continued, clearly trying to regain control of the conversation. "I know you're upset about the divorce, but this is getting ridiculous. You're hurting Lisa and the kids." I bristled at his mention of the kids. "Don't you dare bring my children into this," I snapped. "This isn't about them. It's about you and Lisa thinking you could take everything I worked for without consequence." Jake tried to bluster his way through, but I cut him off. "Here's the deal, Jake. That account? It was a shared asset, which means I had every right to withdraw my portion. And the credit cards? They're tied to my name. So if you're struggling to keep up, maybe it's time you stepped up and started contributing." The silence on the other end was deafening. Finally, Jake muttered something about finding a solution before hanging up. I smiled, knowing that solution was rapidly slipping through their fingers. By the end of the week, I heard through mutual acquaintances that Lisa and Jake were fighting constantly. The financial strain was exposing cracks in their relationship that had been hidden beneath their smug exterior. Lisa was furious that Jake hadn't stepped up to cover the costs, and Jake was growing resentful of her reliance on him. Meanwhile, I continued to live my life, free from their toxicity. I'd started going to the gym again, reconnecting with old friends, and focusing on my career. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control. One evening, as I sat in my new apartment, I got an email from Lisa. The subject line read, "Let's talk." I didn't even bother opening it. The past was exactly where it belonged, behind me. The financial lockdown had done its job, leaving them to face the consequences of their actions. And for the first time, I truly felt free. I knew the financial lockdown had rattled Lisa and Jake, but I wasn't done yet. I wanted to make sure their house of lies completely collapsed. For weeks, I had been gathering evidence, quietly piecing together the story behind Jake's so-called success. It didn't take long to uncover the cracks in his facade. Jake had always presented himself as a self-made man, an entrepreneur with lucrative business ventures. But a few conversations with some mutual contacts told a different story. His businesses were nothing more than smoke and mirrors, failed investments, unpaid debts, and a trail of angry former partners. He wasn't building anything. He was living off other people's money. And Lisa, gullible and desperate for validation, had fallen for it hook, line, and sinker. One morning, armed with a folder of damning evidence, I decided it was time to confront Lisa. I showed up at the house unannounced. The contractors were still there, hammering away at the chaos I'd orchestrated. Jake wasn't home, which suited me just fine. This conversation was for Lisa alone. She opened the door reluctantly, her face a mixture of frustration and exhaustion. "What do you want, Mark?" she snapped. I held up the folder. "We need to talk." She hesitated, but eventually stepped aside, letting me in. The house was in disarray, with half-finished projects everywhere. It was a far cry from the home I had built, and it only reinforced how far things had fallen since I left. I sat down at the kitchen table and placed the folder in front of me. "Lisa, do you even know who you're living with?" She crossed her arms defensively. "Jake is more of a man than you ever were," she said, her tone dripping with contempt. I ignored the jab. "Really?" "Because from where I'm sitting, Jake is nothing but a con artist." Her eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" I opened the folder and slid a few pages across the table. "These are court records showing Jake's unpaid debts. He owes thousands to former business partners. Here's a report from one of his failed ventures. Notice the part where he was accused of fraud but settled out of court? Oh, and this 1 inch, I pulled out another sheet, is a police report from 3 years ago. He was caught writing bad checks. Care to explain how that's more of a man than me?" Lisa's face turned pale as she scanned the documents. This can't be real," she stammered. "It's real, Lisa," I said, my voice steady. "You left me for a guy who's been lying to you from the start. While you were busy mocking me and celebrating your upgrade, he was using you to bankroll his lifestyle." She shook her head, disbelief written all over her face. "No, Jake loves me. He wouldn't do this." "Love?" I scoffed. "Lisa, he's been pressuring you to sell the house, hasn't he? Telling you it's time for a fresh start?" "That's because he needs the money. He's not looking out for you. He's looking out for himself." Lisa was silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the table. For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in her expression. "Why are you telling me this?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I want you to understand something," I said, leaning forward. "I spent years sacrificing for this family. I gave you everything I had, my time, my energy, my money, and you threw it all away for a guy who doesn't even respect you. You humiliated me, Lisa. But I'm not here to humiliate you. I'm here to make sure you know the truth." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and shame. "What am I supposed to do now?" "That's not my problem anymore," I said, standing up. "You made your choice. Now you have to live with it." As I left the house, I felt a strange sense of closure. For months, I had been consumed by anger and resentment, but now that Lisa knew the truth, I felt lighter. Her perfect fantasy was crumbling, and she had no one to blame but herself. That evening, I got a text from Jake, "Stay out of our business." I didn't bother responding. His business was about to implode, and I wasn't lifting a finger to stop it. The truth had a way of spreading quickly, especially when it was laced with betrayal and humiliation. Within days of my confrontation with Lisa, the cracks in her new life with Jake began to widen. She tried to hold on to the illusion, but the weight of reality was crushing her faster than she could manage. Jake's true nature became impossible to ignore. He started pushing harder for Lisa to sell the house, arguing that they needed to start fresh somewhere new. I heard through mutual acquaintances that their arguments had become a regular spectacle, loud enough for the neighbors to notice. What Lisa didn't know, what I had made sure of, was that she didn't even have the authority to sell the house without my consent. It was a chess move I'd planned months ago, and now it was paying off. One afternoon, I got a call from a real estate agent. "Hi, Mr. Anderson," she began hesitantly. "I'm representing a client who says she's looking to sell a property that you're listed as a co-owner of. Would you be open to discussing this?" I couldn't help but smile. "I'm sorry, but there's been a misunderstanding," I replied. "The property isn't for sale." Her pause was telling. "I see," she said carefully. "I'll relay the information to the other party." That same evening, Lisa called me. Her voice was sharp and angry, a stark contrast to the trembling disbelief I'd heard days before. "What the hell, Mark?" she spat. "Why are you blocking the sale of the house?" I leaned back in my chair, taking my time to respond. "Because it's not just your house, Lisa. I still own part of it, remember? And I have no intention of letting you or Jake profit from something I built." Her frustration boiled over. "You're doing this out of spite. You're trying to ruin my life." "No, Lisa," I said, my tone calm and deliberate. "You ruined your life when you chose Jake over me. All I'm doing is protecting what's mine." The next day, I stopped by the house to pick up a few remaining items I had left behind. As I pulled into the driveway, I could hear shouting coming from inside. Jake's voice was unmistakable, laced with frustration and anger. "This is all your fault," he bellowed. "If you hadn't dragged me into this mess, we wouldn't be dealing with this." Lisa's response was muffled, but her tone was defensive. "You said we'd figure it out together. You promised." "Figure it out?" Jake cut her off with a bitter laugh. "I'm not the one who lost control of the house. What kind of plan did you even have?" I stood outside for a moment, listening to the chaos, before deciding to let myself in. They both froze when they saw me, their argument hanging in the air like a storm cloud. "What are you doing here?" Jake demanded, his bravado faltering slightly. "Just picking up a few things," I said casually, glancing around the room. "Don't mind me." Lisa looked like she wanted to say something, but the words caught in her throat. Jake, on the other hand, couldn't resist taking a shot. "You're pathetic, Mark," he sneered, still hanging around like a ghost. "Let it go already." I turned to him, my expression neutral. "You know, Jake, for someone who claims to have it all figured out, you're awfully loud about your failures. Maybe instead of blaming Lisa, you should look in the mirror." His face reddened, but he didn't respond. I picked up the box of belongings I had come for and headed toward the door. Before leaving, I turned back to Lisa. "Good luck with the sale," I said, my voice tinged with sarcasm. "Oh, wait, you can't sell it." "My bad." Within a week, things hit rock bottom. Jake, realizing there was no quick fix to their financial problems, packed up and left. He didn't even bother saying goodbye to Lisa, just a terse text message that read, "I'm done. This isn't worth it." Lisa called me the next day, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. "Are you happy now?" she asked. "You got what you wanted. Jake's gone. The house is a mess, and I'm stuck cleaning up everything." I sighed, not out of sympathy, but out of exasperation. "Lisa, this was never about what I wanted. It was about accountability. You made your choices, and now you're dealing with the consequences." Her silence spoke volumes. For the first time, it seemed like she understood just how much she had lost. Jake was gone, leaving Lisa to face the aftermath of their disastrous choices alone. She had no idea that I still had one final move to make. For months, I had been playing the long game, ensuring every step of my plan was carefully calculated and legally sound. Now, it was time to close the chapter once and for all. I had always intended to sell my share of the house. The property held no sentimental value for me anymore. It was nothing but a reminder of betrayal and wasted years. However, I wasn't going to sell it to Lisa or Jake. They had proven they weren't worthy of the life we had built together. Instead, I had already lined up a buyer, someone with no ties to either of them. The process was swift. Once Jake was out of the picture, the buyer, a well-established real estate investor, moved quickly to finalize the sale. Lisa didn't see it coming. She had assumed that, with Jake gone, she could cling to the house as some semblance of stability. But she underestimated just how thoroughly I had planned her undoing. The eviction notice was delivered on a sunny Tuesday morning. I can only imagine the look on Lisa's face as she opened the envelope, realizing what it meant. The new owner had no intention of letting her stay, even temporarily. She had 30 days to vacate the premises, no exceptions. That afternoon, my phone rang. It was Lisa. I debated letting it go to voicemail but decided to answer, curious to hear her reaction. "Mark," she began, her voice frantic. "What is this? An eviction notice? What the hell is going on?" I kept my tone calm. "It's exactly what it says, Lisa. The house isn't yours anymore. I sold my share, and the new owner wants to take possession. You have 30 days to move out." Her disbelief quickly turned to anger. "You can't do this to me. This is my home. Our home. You don't have the right." "Oh, I absolutely do," I replied, my voice steady. "Remember the terms of the divorce settlement? I retained partial ownership, and now I've exercised my right to sell. You should have read the fine print, Lisa." Her voice cracked, a mix of fury and desperation. "Mark, where am I supposed to go? What about everything we built together?" I couldn't help but laugh, a bitter sound that echoed through the quiet of my apartment. "Everything we built together? You mean the life you threw away for Jake? The same Jake who's nowhere to be found now that things have gone south?" She fell silent. For the first time in years, I could sense the cracks in her confidence. The realization that she had burned every bridge and was now standing alone was finally sinking in. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of schadenfreude for me. Lisa scrambled to find a new place, but without Jake's supposed wealth and my financial support, her options were limited. The new owner of the house wasted no time starting renovations, leaving Lisa to pack her belongings amid the chaos of construction crews tearing apart her once prized home. I stayed out of it, watching from a distance as the consequences of her choices unfolded. Friends who had once sided with Lisa began to distance themselves, unwilling to get caught up in her drama. Even her family, who had initially supported her decision to leave me, grew tired of her constant complaints and poor judgment. One day, as I was leaving work, I received a text from the real estate agent who had facilitated the sale. It was a photo of the house, now completely empty, with a simple message: "The property is officially vacant. Thanks for your business." I stared at the image for a moment, a strange mix of emotions washing over me. Relief, vindication, closure. Lisa tried calling me one last time, but I didn't answer. She left a voicemail, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and regret. "Mark, I hope you're happy. You got everything you wanted. I hope it was worth it." I deleted the message without listening to the rest. It wasn't about getting what I wanted. It was about ensuring I never let someone like Lisa or Jake take advantage of me again. The house was just a symbol, a trophy of their betrayal and my triumph. And now it was gone, just like them. As I walked into my new apartment that evening, I felt lighter than I had in years. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, sat on the balcony, and watched the city lights flicker in the distance. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. The silence was deafening. The movers had taken the last of her belongings, and the house, now stripped of its charm and filled with the echoes of construction, was no longer hers. Lisa stood in the driveway, staring at what used to be her sanctuary, her mind racing with regret. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Jake was supposed to be here, they were supposed to build a life together, and Mark was supposed to fade into irrelevance. Instead, she was alone, homeless, and utterly humiliated. Jake's departure had been the final blow. He left without warning, muttering something about needing space and promising to call, though Lisa knew he wouldn't. He had always been good at taking the easy way out, just as he had taken her trust and her dreams. She replayed Mark's words in her head, words she had dismissed in the moment, but that now lingered with a sting she couldn't ignore. This is on you, Lisa. You made your choices. Her family, once a source of unwavering support, had grown distant. Her mother's disapproving voice rang in her ears during every sleepless night. You had a good man, Lisa. What were you thinking? She hadn't been thinking, she realized. She had been chasing a fantasy, one that Jake had sold her with charm and empty promises. Lisa tried reaching out to Mark, desperate to explain herself, but every call went unanswered, every text met with silence. She wasn't sure what she even wanted to say. Was it an apology? A plea for forgiveness? Or was it just the need to hear his voice, a voice she now realized had been a source of stability she had taken for granted? She spent hours scrolling through her old photos, the ones of her and Mark before everything fell apart. There was a picture of them on their wedding day, her smile radiant, his eyes full of love. Another of them on a road trip, laughing over a spilled drink. She hadn't noticed how happy they looked back then, how simple and genuine their life had been. The weight of her mistakes pressed down on her like a storm cloud. She had traded a life of love and loyalty for fleeting excitement, and now she had nothing to show for it. Lisa's realization came in waves, each one more painful than the last. She thought about the sacrifices Mark had made for her and her family, selling their home to pay her father's medical bills without hesitation. She had mocked his kindness, seen it as weakness, but now she understood the strength it had taken to put others before himself. Jake had never done anything like that for her. He had been a taker, just as she had been, and together they had built a house of cards that collapsed at the first gust of wind. One evening, Lisa found herself walking to a park where she and Mark used to spend their weekends. She sat on a bench near the playground, watching families laugh and play, a painful reminder of what she had lost. She spotted a father with his daughter, pushing her on a swing, and for a moment, she thought of Mark. He would have been an incredible father, she realized. He deserved the kind of love and partnership that built something, not tore it apart. Lisa pulled out her phone and composed a message to Mark. Mark, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need to say this. I'm sorry. For everything. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope you know that I see now how wrong I was. You didn't deserve what I did to you, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. She stared at the words for what felt like an eternity before pressing send. Mark never responded. Days turned into weeks, and Lisa came to accept that he never would. She couldn't blame him. His silence was his closure, his way of moving forward without the weight of her regret holding him back. And maybe that was what she needed to do, too. Accept her choices and live with the consequences, no matter how painful. Her friends dwindled, her family grew distant, and the life she had once taken for granted was nothing more than a memory. She started looking for a job, a small apartment, anything to piece together the fragments of her life. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't easy, but it was her reality now. One night, as Lisa lay in her sparsely furnished apartment, she stared at the ceiling and whispered to no one in particular, I had it all, and I threw it away. The tears came then, hot and heavy, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her loss. The morning sunlight poured through the windows of Mark's new apartment, a modest but cozy space that he had made his own. It wasn't extravagant, but it was a far cry from the house he had sacrificed for someone who no longer mattered. The air was fresh, the weight of his past finally lifted, and Mark stood on the balcony, sipping his coffee as he watched the city awaken beneath him. This was the start of something new, something free of betrayal and toxicity, a life he could finally call his own. The months following the final sale of the house had been transformative. Mark had thrown himself into his work, finding joy in the challenges and rewards of his career. His colleagues noticed the change in him, a lighter step, a genuine smile, a sense of confidence that had been absent for years. It was as if shedding the baggage of his marriage had allowed him to rediscover the parts of himself that had been buried under years of sacrifice and self-doubt. Mark began reconnecting with old friends, people he had unintentionally distanced himself from during his marriage to Lisa. They welcomed him back with open arms, their support and laughter reminding him of the simple joys of camaraderie. Friday nights at the local bar became a ritual, a chance to unwind and share stories without the shadow of Lisa's judgments looming over him. One evening, Mark decided to attend a networking event that a colleague had recommended. It was here that he met Emma, a warm and intelligent woman with a sharp wit and an easy laugh. They struck up a conversation over hors d'oeuvres, discussing everything from career ambitions to their favorite childhood memories. Emma's curiosity and genuine interest in Mark's story were refreshing, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of something he had thought was lost forever: hope. Emma wasn't just a distraction from his past. She was a reminder that new beginnings were possible. They started meeting for coffee, then dinner, and soon, she became a constant presence in his life. She wasn't perfect, no one was, but she was kind, supportive, and honest, and Mark found himself drawn to her authenticity. As his relationship with Emma blossomed, Mark also focused on building a deeper bond with himself. Therapy sessions became a weekly ritual, a safe space where he could unpack the trauma of his past and rebuild his self-esteem. His therapist helped him see that while Lisa's betrayal had hurt deeply, it had also been the catalyst for his growth. He no longer saw himself as a victim but as a survivor, someone who had weathered the storm and emerged stronger on the other side. One weekend, Mark and Emma took a road trip to a quiet lakeside town. They spent the days hiking, laughing, and enjoying each other's company, and the evenings talking under the stars. It was during one of these conversations that Mark realized just how far he had come. He told Emma about Lisa, not to dwell on the pain, but to acknowledge how her betrayal had shaped the man he had become. Emma listened without judgment, holding his hand as he spoke, and when he was done, she smiled and said, "You deserve all the happiness in the world, Mark, and I'm glad I get to share it with you." Meanwhile, Lisa had reached out a few more times, each message tinged with regret and desperation. Mark didn't respond. It wasn't out of spite, but because he knew there was nothing left to say. He had forgiven her in his own way, not for her sake, but for his. Holding on to anger would only hold him back, and Mark was determined to keep moving forward. The story of Mark's rise spread among his friends and colleagues, inspiring others who had faced their own betrayals. He was invited to speak at a local seminar about resilience and personal growth, and though he was hesitant at first, he eventually agreed. Standing in front of a room full of people, sharing his journey, was cathartic. The applause that followed wasn't just validation. It was a reminder of how far he had come. One evening, as Mark stood on the balcony of his apartment, watching the city lights flicker like a sea of stars, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace. His life wasn't perfect, but it was his. He thought about Emma, about his friends, about the future that lay ahead. He had reclaimed his life, built something new from the ashes of his past, and discovered a strength he never knew he had. Mark smiled, raising his glass to the skyline. "Here's to new beginnings," he said softly, the words carried away by the breeze. And with that, he turned and walked back inside, ready to embrace whatever came next.